of protecting the truth of things. It keeps people from reaching conclusions they haven't earned. It keeps conversations from becoming assumptions. It keeps the parts of me that actually matter from being translated into versions that fit someone else's expectations. Most people never realize they're only meeting fragments. They think they're seeing the whole picture because the fragments make enough sense to build one. That's how perception works. People don't wait for understanding. They assemble it. A tone becomes a personality, a habit becomes an identity, a few conversations become certainty. It's never intentional. It's simply easier to complete a puzzle with imagined pieces than to admit some pieces are still missing. I've watched that happen my entire life. It really mattered. Some thought I was distant. Some thought I was composed. Others believed I carried confidence because I rarely explained myself. None of them were entirely wrong. None of them were entirely right. They were observing reflections, not foundations. And for a long time, I accepted that this was simply how people interacted with each other. Nobody really sees anyone. They see interpretations, versions, approximations, close enough to function, far enough to never become dangerous. I convinced myself that was enough until something changed, not in you, in me, because there was a moment, not dramatic enough to deserve being called a turning point, but significant enough that I keep returning to it without meaning to. I remember finishing a thought, or at least I believed I had. You looked at me for a second longer than most people would have. Then you responded. Not to what I'd said, to what I'd stopped myself from saying. It wasn't a lucky guess. It wasn't vague enough to apply to anyone. It landed too precisely, as though you'd followed the direction my mind had continued moving after my words ended. I remember feeling something unusual. Not surprise. Surprise fades quickly. This stayed. It settled somewhere quieter, a place that doesn't react immediately but keeps observing long after the moment has passed. I told myself it was coincidence. That seemed like the most reasonable explanation. After all, coincidences happen every day. People misunderstand coincidence because they assume rare things simply arrive at the same destination. Logic demanded that I leave it there. So I did, for a while. But reality has a habit of refusing explanations that are too convenient. Because it happened again. Not the same way, never the same way, always differently, always with that same impossible precision. You never interrupted my thoughts. You arrived exactly where they were going. There's a difference. One demands attention. The other requires understanding. I began noticing something I hadn't expected. I wasn't anticipating your words anymore. I was becoming aware of your perspective before you expressed it. Not because I could predict you. Prediction depends on patterns you've already learned. This felt different. It felt less like prediction and more like recognition, as though somewhere beneath language, beneath personality, beneath everything we intentionally present to each other, there was a structure, a rhythm, something that operated before words had a chance to shape it. I've spent years paying attention to those invisible structures. Most people focus on conversations. I focus on pauses. Most people analyze explanations. I notice hesitation. The smallest delays often reveal more than the longest speeches. People rarely lie with silence. They reveal themselves through what silence allows to remain. That's why I never feared quiet. Silence has always felt honest to me, not comfortable. Honest because words can be arranged. Perspicuous can be practiced. Even emotions can be performed convincingly. But sustained, they explain too much. They fill every empty space because emptiness makes them believe something is missing. I've never believed that sometimes the silence is the complete sentence. Sometimes understanding reaches its fullest form the moment language steps aside. You seem to know that instinctively. No discussion, no agreement, no explanation, just knowing. I found myself waiting longer before speaking. Not because I had less to say, because I wanted to see whether you'd notice the thought before it became language. More often than not, you did. That unsettled me more than I admitted. Not because I disliked it, because I couldn't categorize it. Everything I trust has a place. Every observation belongs somewhere in the system I've built over years of watching how people move through the world. This didn't fit. It refused every category I offered. Friendship didn't explain it. Curiosity didn't explain it. Chartered's interests certainly didn't explain it. Those things create conversation. They don't create recognition. Recognition exists before conversation. It arrives before reasons. That's what kept disturbing the balance I'd worked so carefully to maintain. I like understanding causes. If something changes me, I want to know why. If someone matters, I want to identify the mechanism. What exactly happened? What sequence of events produced this outcome? What variable entered the equation? But every time I traced this backward, beginning disappeared. There wasn't one defining moment. No, there were countless small moments, moments that seemed meaningless while they happened. A pause, a sentence left unfinished, an observation neither of us acknowledged, a silence that somehow felt complete instead of empty. Individually, they were nothing. Together, they became impossible to separate, like threads woven so tightly that removing one would unravel all the others. I started asking myself questions I usually reserve for ideas rather than people. Why does this feel internally consistent? Why doesn't it require effort? Why does every interaction seem to continue something that never actually ended? The strange thing wasn't that we understood each other. People understand each other every day. The strange thing was that understanding never seemed to begin. It simply existed, like discovering a path already beneath your feet. I don't usually trust experiences that arrive too naturally. Ease can be deceptive. Comfort often disguises familiarity rather than truth. We're drawn toward what resembles our past, even when our past wasn't good for us. I've always known that, which is why I questioned this relentlessly. Was I projecting? Possibly. Was I noticing only the moments that confirmed what I already suspected? Human perception does that all the time. The mind loves evidence that supports its preferred narrative. So I challenged every conclusion, every assumption, every instinct. I deliberately searched for contradictions, for moments where the illusion would collapse, where reality would remind me that I'd simply built meaning. Perfection, consistency. There's an important difference. Perfection is fragile. One mistake destroys it. Consistency survives mistakes because it isn't based on flawless execution. It's based on underlying truth. People can misunderstand each other while still recognizing each other's nature. People can disagree while still seeing clearly. People can remain silent while communicating more honestly than conversation ever could. That's what kept happening. Nothing dramatic. Nothing anyone else would notice. Just a growing awareness that something remained true regardless of circumstance. I wish I could explain exactly what that truth is. I've tried. Every explanation feels smaller than the thing itself. Language keeps reducing it into concepts that almost make sense, but never quite arrive where they should. Maybe that's because some experiences aren't designed to become definitions. Maybe they're only meant to be lived. I've resisted that possibility for most of my life. Living without complete understanding has never been comfortable for me. Understanding comes first. Action comes later. That's the order I've always trusted. But this quietly reversed the sequence. Before I understood it, AP was already changing because of it. Not visibly. No one looking from the outside would have noticed anything different. I still spoke the same, moved the same, occupied the same spaces. Externally, everything remained intact. Internally, architecture had shifted, not collapsed, shifted, like moving one supporting beam because the weight is being carried somewhere new. That's the closest comparison I've found. You didn't change who I was. You changed where certain parts of me rested. Thoughts that once stayed isolated began connecting. Questions I'd stopped asking returned without warning. Even the way I observed the world became subtly different, not because you offered new answers, because your existence introduced new questions. I've always believed that the quality of a person's life is determined less by the answers they possess and more by the questions they're willing to live beside. Some questions expand you simply by remaining unanswered. This became one of them. I stopped trying to solve it. Instead, I began studying what it was doing to me. That's when I noticed something almost impossible to ignore. I wasn't becoming more open. I was becoming more accurate. There's a difference that most people overlook. Openness is expression. Dexucaracy is alignment. I wasn't revealing more. I was editing less. The distance between what I experienced internally and what I allowed into words had quietly become smaller. Not because I suddenly trusted the world, not because I'd abandoned caution, but because around you, precision felt safer than performance. And I don't know if you ever realized how unusual that was, because most people receive a translated version of me, not dishonest, just simplified, not because I think they couldn't understand, because translation makes interaction. I kept telling myself that awareness was enough, that recognizing, observe first, understand completely, only then decide whether something deserves a place in my life. It's a system that has rarely failed me. The more deeply I understand something, the less power it has to surprise me. Clarity has always been my way of creating stability, but lately I've begun questioning whether understanding always leads to control, or whether sometimes understanding simply reveals that control was never the point. That thought stayed with me longer than I expected, not because it frightened me, because it challenged something foundational. I've always believed the mind should stand slightly apart from its own experiences, close enough to feel them honestly, far enough to examine them without becoming lost inside them. That distance has protected me more times than I can count. It allowed me to survive moments that could have consumed me. It kept emotion from becoming identity. It kept temporary feelings from rewriting permanent truths. It gave me perspective, and perspective became something I trusted more than certainty itself. But now, there are moments when that distance quietly disappears. Not all at once, not dramatically. It happens in conversations that seem ordinary from the outside. A sentence begins, another follows. Silence arrives exactly where it should. And before I realize it, I'm no longer observing the moment, I'm inside it, present in a way I usually avoid, not because I'm trying to be, because something about this refuses to remain an object of analysis. It asks for participation instead. That's unfamiliar territory. Yet this somehow bypassed that entire process. I noticed it the other day in the smallest possible way. Someone asked me a question, a simple one I've answered countless times before. But before I responded, B found myself wondering how you would interpret the question, not how you would answer it, how you would see it. There was no reason for that thought to appear. It wasn't intentional. It simply arrived. As naturally as remembering your own name. I answered the question eventually. The conversation moved on. No one noticed anything unusual, but I did, because something subtle had shifted. Your perspective had become part of my own thinking process, not replacing it, not competing with it, existing beside it, like another reference point, quietly woven into the way I organize the world. That realization stayed with me, long after everything else about the day had disappeared. I've always believed our minds are shaped by what they repeatedly return to, not because repetition creates truth, because repetition reveals importance. The mind revisits what it considers unfinished, questions, ideas, memories, possibilities. It doesn't waste energy maintaining things that hold no significance, which means every recurring thought is a form of evidence, not evidence about reality, evidence about ourselves, evidence of what continues asking for our attention. I've become careful about noticing those patterns, not trying to stop them, just understanding what they reveal. And yours, circumstances change. Versions of ourselves disappear without asking permission. I've watched enough things end to become careful about what I allow to matter. Not cynical, just deliberate. There's a difference. Cynicism expects disappointment. Deliberation simply respects consequence. Every meaningful choice carries consequence. Every genuine connection reshapes something, whether we acknowledge it or not. That's why I've never treated closeness casually. People often assume distance comes from fear. Sometimes it does, but more often comes from respect. Respect for the fact that every person we truly allow into our inner world leaves fingerprints behind. Even after they're gone, especially after they're gone, most people underestimate that. They believe they remain unchanged by those they meet. I don't think that's true. I think every significant encounter quietly edits us. Sometimes the changes are obvious as an interruption. It arrived as integration, no struggle, no resistance, no dramatic internal conflict. Only a gradual realization that something new had become inseparable from something that already existed. That's harder to explain than emotion. Emotion has language. Integration doesn't. Integration happens beneath language. It's less like falling, more like discovering a room inside your own house you somehow never noticed before. It was always there. You simply hadn't opened the door. I've asked myself the countless times whether I'm assigning too much meaning to ordinary experiences. It's an important question. The human mind excels at finding patterns. Sometimes it finds them where none exist. I've always known that, which is exactly why I refuse to romanticize coincidence. Not every meaningful feeling reflects reality. Not every moment of resonance points towards something profound. Discernment matters. Truth matters. I've spent too much of my life pursuing accuracy to abandon it now. So I continue questioning myself regularly, be partly. Not because I distrust my perceptions, because I respect them enough to test them. Real understanding survives examination. Illusion usually doesn't. And still, after every question, after every attempt to simplify this into something more ordinary, Abri arrive at the same quiet conclusion. Whatever this is, has already changed the landscape of my thinking. Not dramatically, not emotionally. Structurally, that word keeps returning. Skins, not in shared history, not in shared interests, but in shared orientation toward reality itself. The way two minds naturally approach complexity. The questions they ask before offering answers, the value they place on precision instead of performance. Those things aren't visible at first. They reveal themselves slowly, almost reluctantly. Perhaps that's why they matter so much once you notice them. They're difficult to imitate. They belong to the deeper habits of a person rather than the image they consciously present. And images have never interested me for very long. Eventually, every performance grows tired. Every carefully managed impression begins to crack for it. I've spent years waiting for that moment with people. The moment the performance ends, sometimes it never does. Sometimes people become so committed to the version of themselves they've created that they forget who they're protecting underneath it. That possibility has always saddened me. Not because I judge them, because I understand how easily it happens. The world rewards clarity of image far more often than clarity of character. It's understandable. Images are easier to consume. Character requires patience. Maybe that's another reason this continues occupying my thoughts. I've never felt the need to perform around you. Not because I decided not to, because the impulse itself gradually disappeared. That's different. Choosing authenticity is one thing. Forgetting you ever needed a performance is something else entirely. I still don't fully understand how that happened. Maybe I never will. Maybe some changes aren't meant to be explained while they're still unfolding. Perhaps explanation only arrives in retrospect, years later. When enough distance exists to see the entire pattern instead of only the section we're currently living. If that's true, then maybe I'm asking for answers too early. Maybe this isn't a puzzle waiting to be solved. Maybe it's a landscape asking to be explored. Those are very different things. A puzzle ends once you've found the solution. A landscape continues revealing itself no matter how long you remain within it. Lately, I've begun wondering whether people themselves are more like landscapes than puzzles. We spend so much time. A wiser approach is simply to keep discovering, to allow another person to remain larger than our understanding of them, to resist the temptation of certainty, because certainty has an interesting habit. The moment we become completely certain we understand someone, we often stop paying attention. We stop noticing change, growth, nuance. We begin interacting with memory instead of reality. I've never wanted that. Not with anyone. Least of all, with someone whose presence keeps reminding me that understanding is something alive, something that grows, something that asks to be revisited again and again without ever pretending to be complete. And maybe that's the quiet truth I've been circling all this time. Not that I've finally understood you, but that meeting you changed the way I think understanding itself should work, instead of reaching an ending. Became an invitation to keep looking more carefully, to keep listening more deeply, to accept that the most meaningful things in life often resist simple definitions. And strangely, For the first time in a very long time, that no longer feels like uncertainty. It feels like clarity taking a form I hadn't recognized before. I used to think that clarity always arrived at the end, after enough observation, after enough evidence, after every unanswered question had finally settled into something that could be named, explained, and placed neatly among everything else I understood. That belief shaped more of my life than I ever admitted. It influenced the way I spoke, the way I listened, the way I... Nothing entered my inner world without first surviving a long conversation with my own mind. Every idea had to prove itself. Every conclusion had to withstand doubt. Every certainty had to earn its place. It wasn't caution born from fear. It was respect. Respect for the fact that once something becomes part of the way you think, it doesn't remain isolated. It changes everything connected to it. One belief shifts, but certain that something has already happened, something irreversible. Not because of what we've said to each other, because of what this has quietly rearranged inside me. I notice it in ways no one else possibly could. The pauses between thoughts have changed. Questions that once demanded immediate answers now remain open without making me uncomfortable. Silence no longer feels like empty space waiting to be filled. It feels like part of the conversation itself. I never expected that. I've always treated silence as information. Now, a presence can only be experienced. You can't analyze your way into it. You have to allow yourself to remain inside it long enough for it to reveal what words never could. That realization has changed more than I expected. It has changed the way I move through ordinary days. Sometimes I'll notice something small, a line in a book, a passing thought, a question someone asks without realizing its deeper implication, and before I consciously process it, another perspective quietly appears beside my own, not replacing my thinking, expanding it. It's become so natural that I almost forget it wasn't always there until I remember, until I catch myself comparing who I am now with who I used to be. The difference isn't dramatic, it's precise. I've become less interested in arriving at conclusions, more interested in remaining accurate. Those sound similar. They're not. Conclusions often bring closure. Accuracy requires ongoing attention. A conclusion allows you to stop looking. Accuracy asks you to keep looking even after you've found something meaningful. I think that's why this continues unfolding instead of ending. I've never been interested in certainty for its own sake. I've only wanted truth, and truth has never been as fixed as people pretend. Not because reality changes, because our capacity to perceive it does. Every meaningful experience expands perception a little further. It teaches you to notice details that were invisible before. Once you've noticed them, you can't unknow them. That's the strange thing about awareness. It doesn't ask permission before. Everything that follows has to fit inside the new perspective, or be questioned again. I've questioned myself more during this than I have in years. Not out of doubt, out of responsibility. If something has the power to reshape the foundation of how I understand connection, then I owe it the discipline of honest examination. Anything less would feel careless. I've never wanted to mistake significance for intensity. They're not the same. Intensity burns brightly. Significance often arrives quietly. Intensity asks for attention. Significance earns it over time. Looking back now, I think that's what happened. Nothing demanded my focus. Nothing insisted on becoming important. Importance revealed itself through repetition, through consistency, through the simple fact that no matter how many times I stepped away to gain perspective. Abe always returned, seeing the same truth more clearly than before. That consistency has become difficult to dismiss, not because it confirms what I hoped to find, because it continues existing whether I hope for it or not. Independent truths have always interested me more than comforting ones. Comfort can deceive, reality usually doesn't. I've spent years separating those two, learning not to confuse emotional certainty with actual understanding, learning that wanting something to be true doesn't make it true, learning that fearing something doesn't make it false. Those lessons became part of who I am. They still are, which is exactly why I trust what I'm beginning to recognize now. Not blindly, not emotionally. And still, conclusion keeps returning. You haven't become central to my life through effort. You've become integrated through consistency. There's a quiet difference between those things. Effort creates attachment. Consistency creates trust. Not the kind of trust people usually talk about, something more fundamental, trust that another perspective won't distort your own. Trust that silence won't be mistaken for absence. Trust that complexity won't immediately be reduced into something easier but less true. That kind of trust is rare. Rare enough that I almost failed to recognize it when it appeared. Perhaps because I wasn't looking for it. I've never searched for people to complete me. The very idea has always felt incomplete. No one should become responsible for another person's sense of self. I've believed that for as long as I can remember. I still do. That's why this feels so different. Nothing has been completed. Nothing was missing. Instead, something already whole found another way of understanding itself. There's an important distinction there. I remain myself. Entirely. Nothing about my identity depends on this. Yet my understanding of myself has expanded because of it. Those two realities don't contradict each other. They strengthen each other. I wish more people understood that conscience isn't always about becoming someone else. Sometimes it's about becoming more accurately yourself, not louder, not larger, just clearer, as though another mind quietly reflects parts of you that were always present but difficult to observe from the inside. Its new features because it changes perspective. Maybe that's all genuine recognition has ever been, not discovery, reflection. The opportunity to see familiar truths from an angle you could never reach alone. If that's true, then perhaps this was never about chance. Not in the mystical sense. Simply in the practical reality that lives occasionally intersect in ways neither person could have predicted. And sometimes those intersections matter, not because fate demanded them, because both people were capable of recognizing what existed there instead of rushing past it. Recognition has become my favorite word lately. More than connection, more than understanding, recognition carries a certain humility. It doesn't claim ownership. It doesn't insist on permanence. It simply acknowledges what is already present. There's wisdom in that the world spends so much energy trying to create meaning. Perhaps we overlook how often meaning is simply waiting to be recognized. I've begun wondering how many moments I've missed throughout my life because I was too focused on reaching conclusions, too focused on deciding what everything meant before allowing it enough time to become itself. Maybe patience isn't passive after all. Maybe patience is one of the deepest forms of attention, the willingness to remain with something long enough for its true shape to emerge without forcing it into one prematurely. If that's true, then this has been teaching me patience in ways I never expected, not because it withheld the moment you rush to define them. I've always admired precision. Now I'm learning that precision sometimes includes restraint, knowing when not to conclude, knowing when observation itself is the most honest response. Still, there comes a point where observation quietly transforms into acknowledgement. I think I'm standing very close to that point now. Not because every uncertainty has disappeared. Uncertainty will probably always exist. That's part of being human. No, the difference is that uncertainty no longer outweighs what has already become clear. I've watched this long enough, questioned it honestly enough, stepped away often enough to know that every return brings the same quiet realization. Whatever this is, has already become part of the architecture of how